Alfred Street. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and this month, the Children and Youth Ministry, in conjunction with the Office of Christian Counseling, bring to you an important conversation on youth suicide prevention. We come to you with this conversation entitled, It's Time to Talk. We'll be led by Miss Marcia Leftwich in this conversation with teens and their parents around how to prevent, be aware of, and intervene on behalf of our youngest in order to prevent suicide. We thank you for being here with us, and we hope that this two-part conversation will be engaging for you and your families.
Hi, I'm Marcia from the Office of Christian Care and Counseling. Today, we're going to be having a conversation about suicide awareness, prevention, and intervention. And I'm going to be talking to some amazing youth from Crossover and Higher Ground. I will have Gerald, Gavin, Jemiah, and Zachary. I'm so excited that you're here with us today.
Did you know suicide is preventable? Did you guys know that? You had no idea? Well, we're going to learn about that. Over the last decade, suicide rates in the United States have increased dramatically among racial and ethnic minorities, and particularly in Black Americans. Did you know that? No idea? It's increased a lot. The death rate for suicide for African American men was 4 times greater than for African American women in 2018. In 2019, which was right before the pandemic, suicide was the second leading cause of death for African American ages 15 to 24. So 15 to 24, that's a huge number, right? That age group, that age category, and the fact that it's the second leading cause of death. Did you guys know that? Yes. You knew that? You guys know that? You knew that? Okay, cool. So 50% knew, 50% didn't. So think about that outside of your peers. How many of your peers knew that? So one of the reasons that we wanted to do this was to shed light on suicide, awareness, prevention, and intervention in our community. There has been a stigma, there's been lack of awareness and fear relating to suicide in African American community. There has been a long-standing misconception that Black and brown people do not attempt suicide and do not die by suicide. Today, we want to dispel those myths and provide information. So just a couple facts. So 1 in 6 United States youth ages 6 to 17 experience a mental health disorder every single year. So that's 1 in 6. So we've got 4, so imagine if we had 2 more. Think about the statistics. So 1 out of 6 high school students have considered suicide. So you're in high school, did you know that? Yeah. Did you have any idea? And you're in high school. So did you have any idea of that? 1 in 6. So think about like in the lunch counter or the lunch table, right? 1 in 6 high school students have considered suicide. 50% of all lifetime mental illness begins by the age of 14, and 75% by the age of 24. So what do you guys think about these numbers so far?
Higher than expected. They're a lot higher than expected.
Higher than you expected, right? So it's amazing that just having this conversation now, just think about how many other people don't have the same awareness. So that's one of the reasons we're doing this. It's really important to talk about these things. Here's something else. Did you guys know that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and questioning youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than straight youth? Kinda? What do you mean by kinda?
It's like, well, they get a lot of hate, and like people don't accept who they are, so they would go.
Yeah, so that makes sense.
Harder for them to accept.
Absolutely. So that kind of makes sense that the numbers might be higher. Okay. All right, well, let's get into some conversation, right? Now that we got those facts out and we kind of know, what you might not know, let's just have a conversation. So real quick, self-harm versus suicide. So how much do you guys know about self-harm versus suicide?
I think for self-harm and suicide,
Mm-hmm.
they're weak because like self-harm and cutting yourself,
Yes,
like doing anything like that causes pain. I can feel it feels
absolutely.
like suicide is different.
Right. Okay. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? Suicide versus self-harm?
Different mentality goes into self-harm versus suicide.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
I don't know 100% of the examples, but self-harm is a method of control versus suicide, which is a way to leave a really bad situation.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for that. That was a great way. I couldn't have said it any better. So self-harm is more of a controlled thing. You're controlling, the pain and the sensation. You have more control. Whereas in suicide, it's actually, you want to end your life. Now, the only thing about self-harm is that sometimes self-harm could accidentally lead to suicide. If you cut too deep or if you use an object or something that could end your life. But typically self-harm, those individuals who practice self-harm or mutilation, thank you, they're typically not trying to end their life. They're just trying to deal with pain and they're able to control it. So just keep that in mind. But I'm glad you knew that. That was a very good perspective. So before we jump into our conversation about suicide or self-harm or things like that, do you all have any personal concerns or fears about having this conversation or questions? Okay, cool. All right.
The only hard part is just getting the conversation started.
Mm-hmm. Right. So how do you think? So you mean with your family or with your friends? Which part?
With just anybody.
Okay.
It's like
Right.
Wait, it's hard to explain.
Absolutely.
You can just up and walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, are you having suicidal thoughts?"
Right? So that's one of the things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how to approach that if it's a friend or somebody that you know that is having suicidal thoughts, but also how to approach it if you yourself are having suicidal thoughts. How do you approach your family or a trusted adult? So we're going to talk about that too, right? So let's jump into it. So when you think about that, what kind of conversations are you all having at school or maybe even at church with your church family, peers or any other groups or clubs? What kind of conversations are you all having about suicide?
I mean, we just try to, for my friend group, we just try to let each other know, if you ever do feel that way, you can always come and talk to one of us and then we can go and get you the help that you need.
Mm-hmm. So how comfortable are you having those conversations and or if a friend mentions that they don't want to live anymore, that they do want to kill themselves, how do you handle that?
Well, I try to, calm them down first,
Okay.
if they're, on the verge of, a breakdown or something. And then, try to get them to see, tell me, what happened, or what's wrong, or what led to them feeling that way.
Right.
And then talk about that, and then I'll say, hey, there's this adult that we can go to, and they can help you a little bit more because, I don't really professional.
Right. You're a professional friend.
Yeah.
So have you ever had a situation, and if you're comfortable, you can answer this, or if a friend has come to you and said, don't tell anybody.
Yes.
Okay. And so how do you feel when that happens?
It depends on what they told me.
Well, in terms of suicide.
I'll try to get them to go see someone. Hey, I can go with you.
Yes.
And I can stay with you. I can stay with you while you talk to them. Or if you want, I can just walk you there and then I can back off and you can just have your own personal space to talk to them.
Absolutely. That sounds amazing. And it's scary too. Was it scary?
Yeah.
Yeah. but you were able to help your friend.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So that's one of the things we want to talk about too. And we can just use that as a definite example. If you have a friend or somebody that you know that comes to you and shares these thoughts or these feelings, what do you do? And especially when they say, don't tell anybody. Right? So what were you thinking? I saw you shaking your head.
It's like a no-win situation where like if you do tell somebody, like it's different trust. You shouldn't tell. You shouldn't tell somebody like I mean maybe you should tell them aside not with the person. Like but you should definitely tell somebody.
Okay.
Right. And if they say
Right. So that's something that's really important to kind of, send that message to everybody. There are certain confidences and things that when our friends come to us, then yeah, we absolutely should keep those close. But in the case of suicide or thoughts of suicide, we definitely need to tell somebody. So the first line of defense is to tell your friend that, you care for them, you're concerned, you want them to be here, and that this is not something that you can't not tell somebody. And I loved what you did was you gave them some options. Like, I can go with you, I can tell somebody, you gave them you gave them license to give you what they might have wanted, right? Instead of taking all their power away. So that's another thing you can offer to go with them, but you definitely want to tell somebody. Sure. And you want to tell them, I'm going to have to tell somebody, so that they don't feel like you're breaking their trust. So does that all sound like something that you ought to do? I know you've done it before. And be comfortable, right? So your options are talk to your parents, talk to somebody at school, talk to a trusted adult, but do it immediately and take it seriously. That's one of the main things that we want to remember. Any questions about that? No, I don't know, I'm just looking at you. I know you're fine. So let's talk about having the conversation with your parents, right? If you had thoughts of suicide, just this is an example, and you were feeling some kind of way, first we want to talk about how would you want your parents to create a space for you to come and talk to them? Like, how would you, when you have to have this conversation, what would make it easier for you to go to your parents or a trusted adult? I know it's a hard question.
I would tell an adult who I have a strong relationship.
Absolutely.
I would just tell, you're closer to the me, you're closer.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you would I would tell them about keeping with you.
Okay.
I don't think I would need to do something if I felt that they would appreciate it.
Okay, that's great. So that's a great point. Ideally, it may be a parent. That might be, our idea is that as a parent, and I am a parent, that the front line would be for them to come to me. But it may not be the case. So if they can go to a trusted adult, somebody that they have a close relationship with, that's really good. What would you need from them if you went to them? Is there anything that you would need from them to make it easier for you to have that conversation?
I'd just be there.
Okay.
I would say go talk to just somebody else I can talk to.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of people to talk to.
Right.
But I think I would definitely need just them to be there.
Okay. Anything that you would need from them in terms of words or just be there? And what does be there look like for you?
Be there.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha. Do you want to go ahead?
If you really trust someone enough to confide something like that to them, it isn't really that much focused on the environment as much as the person themselves. If you can trust them or not to confide in them like that.
Okay. What would prevent you from talking to a trusted adult?
You ever had someone that you try to talk to and they're just like, get over it. Or
That's what I was going to say.
The worst advice you could ever give someone. Just be I just don't talk to them anymore.
Right. So what would you need? So for example, if you went to somebody and that was their response, right? your immediate response would be to retract, like to go away, right?
Yeah.
But I want you to kind of bring light to that, because a lot of times when we go to people, what do you feel like they discounted it, they brushed it away, or what you said something else about just
They just like, they don't get it. It's basically, is what I'm saying. Like, they're just like, just be happy.
be happy.
Like, just, there's someone that has it worse than you.
Mhm.
Like, don't.
And so that's not helpful, right?
No, it's like, it just makes you feel even worse. Because it makes you really think about it. You're like, well, yeah, I shouldn't feel this way because there is someone that has it worse than I do.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing you say is you don't want them to discount your feelings, brush it away. It's like, just be happy. Someone else is doing not as good as you, right? You want them to validate.
If somebody says, "Oh, this person has it worse than you," that doesn't mean that you should discount your own problems. Because I mean, everybody's suffering from something. Just you gotta look deep enough.
Yeah, I think that like saying that you gotta know this. Well, you can't say it's like it's a person you're in a bad place because that's I mean, I'm sure that's gonna make you think like, yeah, I'm not. I could be maybe like not overreacting, but I could take it second to be right. Like that sentence is like you gotta know when to say.
Right.
Don't just say that.
Absolutely. And that's a great point. And I think, were you going to say something? Oh, okay. Sorry. I think too, so again, what would be more helpful instead of them saying those things like, just be happy or somebody has it worse than you, what would you prefer to hear?
Tell them that you care about them, that you value friendship with them, relationship.
Awesome. Did you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, sometimes it's not even like, sometimes we just need someone to listen. Because sometimes you can tell them something and they're too busy trying to like make you feel better that they actually end up just doing the opposite, and you leave the conversation even more like emotional than when you started.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes if somebody just if somebody needs to talk to somebody because they're feeling depressed or something, sometimes the best conversations are just when one person's just venting to the other, and they might occasionally respond or agree, but it's just mostly the venting.
Yeah. So those are great points. You want somebody to listen. You want them to not have their own agenda and trying to make you feel better, right? And you want them to genuinely care and not try to fix it, maybe. So those are all great tips. Let's see, what else I'm going to ask you guys? Let's jump into maybe peer pressure, social media, and those types of influences, and how that affects suicide, at least in your age group.
First thing my brain jumps to is cyberbullying.
Okay.
Which is pretty much just bullying, but online, which can be a whole lot worse because, I mean, a lot of people spend so much time on social media, so if that's what they're seeing for most of the time, they might end up starting to believe it.
Right. Cyberbullying is huge, and I think it's actually a crime now.
Yeah,
I think.
Accident.
Yeah.
It's like if they make it illegal because of the amount of suicide subsequently because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about it is, it seems so behind the scenes, because people think, oh, if I'm online, nobody's going to know. But there's so many ways to track it, and there's so many ways to, they know.
You can have 30 accounts and they're going to find the exact ranges.
So how do you all feel about that? This, cyberbullying, even these social media challenges that are encouraging, people in your age group to do things that could potentially end their life. Like, have you all had any conversations about that or thoughts about it? No.
What challenges?
So there's been challenges, I don't want to talk about them, but there's been different challenges where, youth are encouraged to do certain things, but unfortunately they could potentially lead to death. And so If you guys don't know about it, maybe that's a good thing. But they're just from an awareness standpoint. You know, some of these videos and people doing things that actually can cause deaths. But you guys don't have any thought. You guys don't talk about that stuff. But cyberbullying is real in your community, like in your schools and things like that. How do they handle it? Or how do you guys even have conversations about it?
As if I was being cyberbullied.
Either way.
I mean, it's all about how you look at it. Like, if you know that like people like making fun of you and you like, in a way, you still go on.
Okay.
Sometimes you gotta take it. Like, I get it. Like, you have every right to go back to social media and do whatever you want. But then again, you can't really like sit there and be that upset if you know they're going to keep opening it. So it's like doing it to yourself a little bit.
Okay.
And in fact, where you shouldn't have to experience that, but you should take a break. That's what I would do.
Okay. So what would you say to, you know, some of your peers that are having issues with cyberbullying? And it's getting to the point where they are thinking about to, okay, report it. So what would you do if the person that's being bullied is not in a position to report it, but you know about it?
I think if I knew about it and then they're getting about it to be bad, I would tell someone.
Okay, great.
But like I would like make some sheets and take pictures of them. You know?
Right.
Evidence.
Right. Those receipts. Definitely receipts.
If you're reporting somebody who's bullying you, it's best to bring evidence.
Okay. And how do you do that on, like, you know, social media? You can actually get those receipts?
Screenshots.
Okay.
Nothing ever wasted. Like you can delete it from the camera, everybody can delete it next.
Oh,
You can almost just like, you know, it's like,
they can find it.
like retrieve it, yeah. It's
And people know that. Like, y'all know that as a general rule, that it's still out there.
Yeah,
But y'all still do it. I mean, not you guys, but.
We've watched all the PSAs that they showed us in elementary school.
About cyberbullying.
Yeah, and the digital footprint. Make sure you don't act like a jerk online because colleges might see it.
You know, there's that. All right. So let's talk about advocacy, right? And barriers to getting treatment and or having the conversation about suicide. So in terms of advocacy, one of the main things is that getting you all comfortable to have the conversation with your parents, a trusted adult, or your friends. And then guess what? You all can also have conversations with your peers to encourage them to do the same thing. So there's a ripple effect. Y'all know about science and the ripple effect, right? Got it. So you tell somebody, they tell somebody, and it can create healing across all layers, right? So let's talk about the advocacy piece. And we already talked about things that you feel are necessary when you want to talk to an adult, but also with your friends, being open, being present, listening. And that's one of the big things. So we're going to actually have a conversation. I'm going to have a conversation with some parents, right? And one of those big things is we're going to talk about actively listening, which is something that I heard all of you say was listening and being present. So that's one of the big things. So in terms of advocacy is having a safe space to go and have these conversations. Would you guys agree to that? Right? What else do you think would help somebody advocate for themselves? And we'll get to your point in a sec.
Other people who have the same problem.
Other people who have the same problem, absolutely. So what do you think that would look like?
Talk about what they go through and how they're similar and different stuff. Both advocate.
Yeah, so just being able to find your voice and find treatment, right? Or find somebody to talk to. So this was an excellent point, and I'm going to put you on the spot real quick because you brought up an excellent point about seeking treatment, seeking therapy, seeking someone to talk to, and barriers that prevent people from doing that. So let's talk about stigma real quick. So at the very top, when I was talking about there's a stigma in our particular community of Black and brown people who don't seek treatment, who don't seek therapy. They don't want to talk about it. And we need to, kind of destigmatize that because it's really important that not only are we bringing awareness, but we should also bring awareness that it's important for people to talk about it, men and women, which I'm going to switch over to you because you made an excellent point. And if you don't mind sharing it, you had a very poignant point?
It was just that society, it always tells like men, like specifically black men, that it's a weakness and we need to like go get help, or like if you feel like if they have depression or if they feel basically anything besides strong, and it basically makes them feel like, oh, I can't cry. Like they're taught at a very young age that like you're a man, like man up, you're fine, stop crying, like which could damage them in their adult life, and they're going to think that, okay, this happened to me, but that's fine, I'm fine, or I feel like I want to end my life, but I'm not going to talk to someone about it because that would mean I'm weak or I'm not a man anymore.
So thank you so much for bringing that. I'm almost speechless because that is such a big point, especially in our community, right? And we have 3, black men up here. So maybe let's ask you all, right? How do you feel about what she shared, and how do we overcome that? How do we overcome, especially in your peer group? Because honestly, I have 2 boys myself. I have two sons, and of course, growing up, as a mom, we teach one thing, dads teach other things, right? In terms of manning up and all of those types of things. And so how do we overcome that so that you all have safe environments, but you also find your voice when you're in a vulnerable state or when you are having thoughts or you might need to seek treatment? So I'm going to throw it back over here.
You can talk to a friend,
Okay.
like somebody that, like another person that's going through that. And just talk to them.
Okay.
And just express how you feel.
Any thoughts about what she said about those barriers? Since you guys are black men?
I mean, the best way to have somebody to actually open up is to have an environment where they might have trusted people who know it's okay for the person to open up. Because if they're just around people who are also saying, "Hey, man up, you can't have feelings," that it's just not going to work.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts around that, or what might help? I'm going to throw it out. What conversations can you all have with your other male friends to teach them about advocacy, to teach them about talking about their feelings and their emotions, especially when it may not be, positive. It may be some sadness. It may be, let's not say weak, because there is strength in having conversations about your thoughts, your feelings, and your emotions. It's the opposite of weak. It's actually strong, and it's very courageous. So maybe, if, just thinking about it, how could you share or empower your male friends to speak up, to find advocacy, to find somebody to talk to?
But if they get to that point where they need to talk to somebody, I think I could advocate.
Okay, awesome. And I think another thing to think about, kind of maybe a step after this, is maybe once you guys get home and maybe in a couple of days, maybe just jotting down some notes of things to remember or things to share, so that if you're in this position, even for yourself, like how to advocate for self, this is what I need to do, and or sharing that with your friends and having the conversation, because guess what? Y'all are change agents, and we're having this conversation, and now you have the influence to share that out. So maybe that's just something to think about. I won't say homework because then y'all will look at me crazy, but just something to think about after the fact, right? Any other thoughts? That was a really important thing that you brought up. I appreciate that. You should be over here doing this. You should be in this seat. Anything else about that? Just talking to your friends about that? Well, let's throw it back this way. What about in your female friends that are black and brown? What about that stigma? I mean, we're usually more talkative and, emotional, but what do you find? Is there any barriers to getting assistance that your peer group, your female friends, we might need to be aware of?
Well, sometimes I feel like for adults, they just feel like they're not gonna understand.
Okay.
Because a lot of times when teenagers try to talk to adults, specifically teachers,
Okay.
they think like it's not a big deal. Like they don't try to like see, like they always say like, oh, who's your age at one time, but they don't ever, they don't ever think about how this would have been a big deal, like a huge deal when you were this age. Instead, just like that's literally nothing. Like get over it. So sometimes that can make them not want to talk to adults.
That's amazing. So let me just, and I'll ask this to all of you. What is your first line of say, intervention or advocacy when there's an issue, right? Is it a teacher? Is it your parent? Is it a trusted adult? Is it a club leader? In terms of, because that gives us a broader spectrum of who we really need to be talking to. Because, you brought up a good point about teachers. And I used to teach. I used to teach in middle school. And so I know how I would interact with my students, people that would come to me. But that may not be the general population of teachers, right? Some teachers may be discounting the feelings and thoughts. And I think that's a great point that you made up. Like, oh, I was young once and I know blah, blah, blah. And that obviously is not helpful. Right? So, where do you all find, your first line of intervention and how do you kind of figure that out? Is it teacher, parent, aunt, uncle, cousin?
It really depends on who we're close with.
Okay.
Obviously, parents, trusted adult, uncles.
Family members. Any ideas about when that's not an option, right? Like I can tell because you had mentioned that before. Obviously, parents are your first line, family members, and that's perfect. That's great. But what do you say to your peers when that's not an option?
Get a good group of friends when you do that.
Okay.
Like, if you don't have that village, even if it's around you, it doesn't even, you don't even need like 1 to need 3 or 4 good people.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. So get a good group of village, get your tribe, your front row. Very good. You guys have any thoughts?
It doesn't have to be a big village. It just has to be a village that cares about you.
Okay. Sounds good. So let's talk about prevention real quick. We kind of talked about finding a trusted adult, having a safe space. But can you think of anything, and I'll, of course, give you all some strategies and tips. Is there anything that you can think of that you all could be doing and or your friends to prevent the possibility of attempting suicide?
You gotta be the older friend.
Okay.
Don't make it hard for them to come to you and talk to you. And I think
that's amazing. I love that. Be the open friend. I like that. You need to write that down. Be the open friend. You were gonna say?
I was just gonna say, like, just let them know that, just let them know that you're there. Like, if you don't want to talk right now, that's fine. Like, don't push them to talk because that's just going to make them shut down. Let them know, like, hey, when you're ready, I'm here for you.
Okay, that sounds good. And then there's some things that you all can do in the process of that with self and your friends, but things like, building resiliency, right? The ability to bounce back, but having coping strategies, because one of the things, and this is the interesting that you were alluding to, as adults, we forget that we know that everything is going to be okay. But as a youth, you just have a limited perspective of life, and you can't necessarily kind of extrapolate out that a year from now, this may or may not be as big a deal it is right now, not to discount it. So coping strategies and building resiliency, how do you all do that now in terms of when you're stressed out or you get disappointed, right? Because that's sometimes what happens with youth. You have a disappointment, you have heartbreak, you have, something happened, and you really feel like this is the end and you just don't want to be here anymore. So what could you do in terms of coping strategies, building resilience in your life so that when those moments happen, because they're going to happen, there's going to be something that's going to happen that can trigger you. But what can you do so you don't get triggered all the way to possible suicidal thoughts?
If a trusted person is around, somebody who cares about you is around, spend some time with them and doing that will remind you of how much you are loved or cared about or just wanted to be around.
Absolutely. I love that. And one of the main things I was going to mention was connection. Maintaining connection. Family, friends, community, church, organizations. I don't know if any of you all play sports, but team sports are a great way to stay connected. Clubs at school, all of those things. Church, crossover, higher ground, those types of connections. Maintaining those connections, maintaining those relationships can help when you hit the brick wall and you're just like, this is too much, and or I'm feeling some kind of way. So family, friends, connection. I love that you mentioned that. Any other thoughts about building resiliency, coping mechanisms?
Things that bring me peace.
Absolutely. Self-care. Right? So when you think about things that bring you peace, can you give us some examples? What brings you peace? Let's put it that way.
What brings me peace? I like to draw and write. I like writing my feelings.
Absolutely. So having those creative outlets. So for you, it's the writing, the drawing, releasing it, right? And so I encourage everybody, and that's something else that you can encourage your friends, have outlets, especially releasing outlets, stress relief. Before we started recording, and I was like, let's shake it out, right? That's another way to release, things, because your emotions need motion. And whether that's sports, whether it's dancing, whether it's writing, whether it's the drawing or any kind of movement, moving it out of your body, that's another coping strategy. It's another way to build resiliency. We haven't talked about faith. We haven't talked about our faith and being grounded. Anybody want to talk about that? And how that helps or can help?
You can pray,
Absolutely.
and you can just talk to God.
Amazing. Yes. And what about, I know one thing I try to encourage people to do is have scriptures for different phases or different things that you're going through. So have you ever used those strategies? Maybe have a scripture, have a memory verse. I mean, we all remember in Sunday school, you have your memory verses. And we're sometimes like, when am I ever going to use these? But, through life, we have that ability to draw on those verses that we learned or finding them that work. So you guys want to talk about the faith aspect? Anything that comes to mind?
They get tied into it a lot.
Okay.
I think it's definitely another village to
Yeah.
support.
Mm-hmm.
It's guide you, get you through.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else talk the faith part of it? That connection of faith is amazing. Prayer, talking to God, talking to your spiritual family and getting perspective is also helpful. It's also very grounding to have that, I've got the Bible, I've got my guidebook, I've got my roadmap here, got my scriptures. You definitely have, crossover and higher ground. You have, Sunday service. All of those things maintain that connection, but also front line into our faith. Let's talk about really quickly some risk factors and warning signs that you can identify in yourself and or others. So do you guys have any ideas of some risk factors off the top of your head before I give you some technical ones?
Giving away the job. Wanting to
Absolutely.
give you their most prized possessions.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. Giving away prized possessions and their valuables.
Like, I don't know, like they're like being really appreciative of everybody. Thank you being there.
Like overly.
Say bye.
Mm-hmm. Right, so that's a great one. So since you brought that up, let's talk about some signs and possible warning signs, right? So giving away possessions, starting to be really more, maybe like appreciative and showing a different different signs of love or appreciation that the person wasn't before, kind of unwarranted. Anything else? Those are good.
Like doesn't want to do any things, like say like you play basketball and like everyone knows that's your thing, like you never miss a game.
Yes.
And you just I don't want to do it no more. I'm just like I quit.
Mm-hmm. That's a big one. Losing interest in the things that you possibly were very passionate about, especially, you know, for athletes. If you've been doing it for a really long time and all of a sudden you're just like, I don't want to do it. And it's not just because you're burnt out. It's because you just literally got to the point where you don't want to do it because you want to end your life. So that's a really good one. Any other thoughts on that?
I feel like getting bullied, you just like let the bully just bully you. You just like take all the pain.
Wow, that's really powerful. So you think that's a warning sign to the person's basically like, what else can I do? That's a really good one. I think that's something that we should bring to light, is that if you see somebody getting bullied and they're like just letting it happen from the standpoint of they feel like there's nothing else that they can do, that could be a warning sign. Especially, you know, when you said they're just taking the pain, as if maybe they feel like they deserve it and that there isn't another option. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Any other warning signs or thoughts before I give you the...
Someone that's been like, I don't know if it's like, but like like someone that likes to hang out.
Right.
You know, they like to go out, and then all of a sudden they're just like, I don't want to be around people. I want to just be by myself.
Withdrawing. That's a definite one. You guys have hit all of them, basically. Oh, shoot, what about this one? Changing your eating or sleeping habits, things like that, outside of the norm of your age group, right? That's another one. You said loss of interest in usual activities, withdrawing from friends and family, acting out or running away, being extremely aggressive is another one. Neglecting one's personal appearance and hygiene, just not caring, just everything just goes to the wayside in terms of personal physical care. We didn't mention alcohol and drug use, but that's another one. Outside of normal experimentation, and elevated use of alcohol and drugs could be a warning sign as well. How about risk taking? Have you guys ever thought that was a risk factor, or a warning sign was risk taking?
Yeah.
Do you guys have you ever seen that in like any of your friends when they just start being real risky in their behavior? You have? What kind of? Okay, yeah. Drug use, experimenting outside of the norm, and I say that because there's always a little bit of experimentation, but when it's elevated and it becomes risky, so that's a really good point. I don't think anybody mentioned this, but obsession with death and dying, or having conversations about death and dying, almost an obsession where the conversations are all about that. So those are basically all the warning signs that you can be aware of. And of course, it's tricky in the youth category because sometimes mood swings as well. So outside of the norm, sometimes you guys are going to be moody. Sometimes your appetite changes, interest level changes, but anything that's really outside of your norm. So what I suggest for all of you all to understand is, what's your baseline? What is my baseline interest level in this and this? So if it drops, I may need to start talking to somebody about it. Or if I'm starting to think this way 90% of the time, and before I was thinking about it 10% of the time, I might need to talk to somebody. So just knowing your own personal, this is where I'm at. If I go here, I probably need to talk to somebody. So that's kind of an evaluation that you all can do, self-reflection. But you can also share it with your friends. And you guys probably know your friends' baseline too. So when you can probably tell when something's off, even in family members, like with your brothers, right? Sisters, other family members, you kind of know when they're here and when they're here, and then you might need to raise the level of awareness. Any questions on that one? We talked about risk factors, but we talked about warning signs. Here are a couple of risk factors that you guys may or may not know. And we kind of talked about stats before, but 46% of people who died by suicide had a known mental health condition. But here are some other things that might make the risk factor even more. So a family history of suicide, and or a friend or classmate or a schoolmate that has recently died by suicide might increase the risk of suicide. Substance abuse, we talked about that. Intoxication, so more than 1 in 3 people who die from suicide are under the influence of alcohol at the time of their death. So that's another risk factor. Access, so we didn't talk about access, but again, being aware of the different types of access and being aware that it may not always be a mortal wound, and a mortal wound is basically by a firearm, but it could be a belt, it could be pills, it could be any other object that can inflict death. So just be aware, right? Everyone may not have access to a gun, but they may have access to a belt. And that in the youth category, belts are typically one of the first things that are used in terms of access and accessibility. So did you guys know that? Mm-hmm. What did you guys think was the main tool or more accessible item for people dying by suicide? Guns or pills? Mm-hmm. So interestingly enough, most men and young men who die by suicide use a mortal form like a gun. Most women use a more passive way like pills or a belt. And that's just kind of across the board. But in like the youth category, belts and pills are typically the most accessible. And it's not always a prescription drug. So just keep that in mind as well. Did you guys know that it's not always a prescription? It could be an over-the-counter medication. If you take enough, could make you really sick. So just keep that in mind. It's not always a firearm. Gender, we already talked about the LGBTQ community. And in your category, questioning youth in terms of their individual sexuality can actually be a risk factor as well. History of trauma and abuse, prolonged stress, changes in family dynamics sometimes, death and or an incarcerated parent, and or divorce or separation. So consider that as well. Anything else about risk factors or warning signs that we haven't talked about? Anything else you guys think we should talk about or bring to light? No? All right, well, we have had a very robust and rich conversation. I appreciate you guys so much. I'm thinking of ideas of how we can do something like this again. But before we go, maybe each one of you can kind of give a tip about awareness, prevention, or intervention, either something that you learned or something that you might want to share just as we close out. And I don't know, y'all can
be so in your own head, like don't always, you have to always remain focused.
Okay.
You gotta focus on other people.
Okay.
Put your attention on other people.
Okay.
Be considerate.
Be considerate of others' feelings. I love that. Thank you. Who wants to go next? I won't go in order.
You need to like make sure if you're the person that doesn't take care of yourself, like you're like, oh, I need to make sure everyone else is okay. You need to do like the opposite. Like you need to also make sure that you're good before you can go on and like continue helping.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I don't know.
I say have a good connection with friends and make sure like they're real friends, not fake friends. And then I'm saying just be open to listen to them. And then I do say make sure you take care of yourself. That's very important.
Thank you for that.
It's no matter what somebody tells you, or no matter how many people tell you that you don't matter, everybody deserves to be respected and to be happy.
Thank you for that. And one thing that we didn't talk about, but might be another conversation, is that whole topic of self-care, which a couple of you had mentioned, the importance of taking care of self. So we're going to put a pin in that, maybe come back one day and talk about self-care, especially for youth. But Zachary, Maya, Gavin, Gerald, I thank you all for your time and your energy and everything that you shared. Thank you guys so much.